Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. My name is Julia Raskin. I'm the Trails Program Manager at the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City. I'll be moderating this panel on the intersectionality of trails, equity, and environmental justice. So before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping details. First, this session is recorded. And after the summit, the recordings of this and all other Academy sessions will be made available on the New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition and the New Jersey Safe Routes website. Second, in order to move today's session along, we would like everyone to use the Q&A function for questions. The chat will be available for conversations, but as I said, if people can put their questions in the Q&A, it will be much easier for me to find them. So thank you in advance for that. I'm going to kick this off by introducing myself and saying a little bit about my work. As I mentioned, my name is Julia Raskin. I'm the Trails Program Manager at the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City. The Natural Areas Conservancy is the nonprofit partner to New York City parks, helping to manage and restore 10,000 acres of forests and wetlands on New York City parklands since 2012. Our team of scientists and experts promote nature's diversity and resilience across the 5 boroughs, working in close partnership with the City of New York. In 2017, we started working in partnership with the Parks Department to create the citywide trails team, which works to formalize and maintain the nature trails going through these natural areas throughout the city. This year, I've been working on the release of the Strategic Trails Plan, which will be officially released and actually in the next couple of weeks. The plan is a blueprint for the management of the citywide nature trail network, which is made up of over 350 miles of nature trails that offer park goers a range of experiences, from forests to coastal wetlands and marshes, all of which connect people to the vast natural areas in New York City parks. So you might be wondering how someone who works in nature trails, which are actually largely natural surfaces, not paved, kind of got plugged into this great community of transportation advocates. So just a couple years ago, I worked for the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, and I sat on the Circuit Trail Steering Committee. During that time, I wrote the Inclusive Trail Planning Toolkit for the Circuit Trails Coalition, which takes a community organizing approach to trail planning and is a basic kind of guiding document for doing outreach for trail projects. So a big thanks to anyone who might be here from the Circuit Trails Coalition who helped to make that toolkit come to fruition. I couldn't have done it without the coalition. And if anyone is interested in checking that toolkit out, there is a link in the conference's resources, and I'll also put a link in the chat a little bit later. So I am honored to be introducing this incredibly impressive panel of women working in transportation and environment who are leading the charge in not only protecting and building parks and green spaces, but also ensuring that they are accessible to all people. So today we have with us Olivia Glenn, the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. We also have Renee Reynolds, the Executive Director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, and Brandi Chapman, the State Trails Coordinator for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. They will each give 10-minute presentations, and then I will ask them some questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So as the presentations go on, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will keep track of them. So I'm going to hand it over to Olivia.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to give a really big thanks to Deborah Kagan of the New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition for inviting me to speak at today's summit. I am delighted to talk with you today because environmental justice and equity is some of the most important work being undertaken by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I've personally spent a great deal of my professional life working to ensure that every New Jerseyan has the right to experience and enjoy the benefits of nature and a healthy environment. For me, I was deprived of that very right as a child. I grew up in the city of Camden in New Jersey, on a street that itself only had 4 trees, and that had a park about 8 blocks away that was not only unsafe itself, but also there was not a safe walking or biking corridor to reach that park. So where did my friends and I spend our time? We played right on our block, on the sidewalks and in the street outside of our homes. There was no place else to go. It was not until I attended college that I think I truly understood the power and potential of open spaces and trails. Areas that were clean, green, and safe to run, walk, hike, bike, and even to just sit and read or watch people walk by. And not just the destination, but also the corridor that you take to get there. And that is what inspires me to ensure that others, particularly those in overburdened communities, have access to clean, safe, green spaces and trails. And this work is especially important in New Jersey because we are the nation's most population dense state. And additionally, we are the nation's fourth most diverse state. So at this time, I'm going to share some PowerPoint slides with you as I speak through the presentation. So before I begin, I want to dive into defining environmental justice. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. For us in New Jersey, we certainly underscore this definition. We support this definition, but for us, we see it as a threshold for the work that we do. For us, we not only look at disparate impacts, we also look at the inclusion of benefits to improve quality of life. So here is just a list of key milestones in environmental justice. And I want to underscore that any work that we do in environmental justice was first advanced by communities that were impacted by these disparities. It goes all the way back to the 1960s, when civil rights leaders noted environmental inequities that were endangering public health. And after their decades of making their concerns known, the EPA convened its first environmental equity work group in 1990. In 1991, again by grassroots movement, there was the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that was held in Washington, D.C. that had representatives from all around the country that came together and established the 17 principles of environmental justice that undergird all the work that we do today that furthers environmental justice. So on a federal level, in 1994, President Clinton issued the first environmental justice executive order, 12898. And since that time, departments and agencies on a federal level, and then correspondingly on state and local levels, have established environmental justice priorities. And it's not just environmental agencies that have been targeted with these objectives. As you can see here from this timeline, this is also work that transportation and highway agencies have also been dedicated to, going all the way back to 1997. Here in New Jersey specifically, there are some specific actions that have happened in the last several years under the current administration with Governor Murphy that I want to make note of. The first is the issuing of the Environmental Justice Executive Order. And then most recently in 2020 was the passage of the nation's first environmental justice law. And the reason that I have a black box around that blue priority is because it was deeply due to the work of grassroots communities that moved that effort along. They have been dedicated to this legislation over a decade, and it has taken this long for it to be passed. So certainly want to give them their credence for these efforts. So the picture that is shown here on the left is when Governor Murphy signed the environmental justice law in September 2020. And the picture on the right is when he issued the environmental justice executive order in his first 100 days in office. The environmental justice executive order required the development of a guidance document that was just completed last year, shortly after the passage of the environmental law. And if you would like to access that guidance document, it is available on the DEP website at nj.gov/DEP/EJ. And I'll make sure when I'm done speaking that I drop that link in the chat for you. So that guidance document creates the framework for all of the executive branch of government to work with a whole of government approach to advance environmental justice considerations. The environmental justice law, while it's the most progressive in the nation, is more so focused on permitting issues for certain types of facilities. So the executive order enables us to take the approach that is much more holistic to bringing remedies for our overburdened communities. And so how do we define environmental justice? Within our guidance document, we walk through the process by which we define these communities. First, we look at overburdened communities or communities of concern. So we look at the social demographics of a community. Then we overlap that with the absence of environmental and public health benefits, as well as the disproportionate presence of environmental and public health stressors. And certainly when we're thinking about some of the public health considerations, we know that trails bring health benefits to communities. We know certainly that there are asthma, cancer, and cardiovascular disease rates that are higher in overburdened communities and communities where they don't have good access to open space and trail networks. And we also know that there are other health considerations like diabetes and emotional stress. So those are certainly some of the stressors that exist on top of the environmental stressors, the air pollution itself. In looking at some of the benefits that we note that are often lacking or absent in overburdened communities, some of those include lack of access to high quality parks, as well as access to important things like trail networks so that communities have safe corridors to get to those spaces. So when we are looking at the environmental justice law in New Jersey and talking about what an overburdened community is, we're talking about communities that are at least 35% low income, and this is at a block group, a census block group level, at least 35% low income, at least 40% minority, or at least 40% limited English proficient. And on that same link that I will drop in the chat, you will see a map here of the overburdened communities. And we have a number of tools that are available where you can download this map yourself and use it to help you in your own efforts as you're looking at how you build out your trail networks and set your priorities. So on this slide here, some of the tools that we have available, we have an Excel spreadsheet that pretty much provides the primary source material with how we identified these communities. We have an interactive mapping tool where you can literally type in an address and see if it falls within the boundaries of an overburdened community. We also have PDFs that you can download for each and every municipality that has overburdened communities within its borders. We also have a downloadable GIS layer, so you can use it to align with other layers that you may have yourself. In addition, we also have some technical resources available, as well as frequently asked questions to address those things that most often come up. And there's the URL for you right there to access that overburdened communities mapping tool. And so when we look at New Jersey specifically, in the context of trails, why is this so important to make a nexus between trails and environmental justice? Nationwide, the transportation sector is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Nationwide, in 2015, transportation represented 27% of total US greenhouse gas emissions. This includes cars, trucks, commercial aircraft, and railroads. But in New Jersey, this is much more pronounced. As this data shows here, in New Jersey, 42% of our greenhouse gas emissions in 2018 came from transportation sources. And of these transportation sources, currently, gasoline-fueled vehicles account for over 70% of the transportation sector's emissions. So when considering opportunities to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, it is critical that we have a multi-pronged approach, not just electric vehicles, not just electric vehicle infrastructure and public transportation. We must also assess our non-motorized transportation infrastructure as a critical component of reaching even our environmental greenhouse gas emission goals. And of course, trail networks are a critical part of helping us achieve this success. So there is no doubt that bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in New Jersey is an equity and environmental justice issue. And as Julia noted in her introduction, I am delighted to have one of my colleagues here from the DEP, Brandi Chapman, who will speak more specifically about the work that we're doing on trails in New Jersey. But before we move forward to talk about that work, when we design that network, it should not just be through the lens of equality. It should consider inequities. Equality provides the same resources for everyone without giving any consideration to those who may have different needs. Equity provides the resources so that regardless of your individual needs, you have the same shared experience. And certainly this same context applies for when we're looking at how we should prioritize, build, and design our trails. They should be all inclusive for youth, elderly, carless households, the disabled, a parent with 3 kids in a stroller, and the avid cyclist. So let's keep everyone in mind as we go forward and advance this critical work. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Olivia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. Okay. As mentioned, my name is Brandi Chapman. I'm coordinator of the New Jersey Trails Program, which is administered by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and is housed under the Green Acres program, who is celebrating their 60th birthday today. So happy birthday, Green Acres program. The first thing I want to kind of touch base on is, why are we talking about trails? There's so much going on in the world. Why are trails important to anybody? Why do trails matter? Well, they enhance our communities by giving us access to preserved places and scenic landscapes with minimal disturbance to the natural world. They provide outdoor classrooms to learn about our natural and cultural world. They improve the economy through tourism, connect to population centers, and they provide alternative transportation corridors. And last, but certainly not least, trails contribute significantly to the health of residents, particularly in the most densely populated state in the nation. Trails are truly at the intersection of conservation and recreation. For all these reasons and more, trails deserve our attention. And I'm happy to announce that the governor agrees. Hot off the press is this, this proclamation signed by the governor to acknowledge that this Saturday, June 5th, is National Trails Day. It was first celebrated in 1993 to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the National Trail System Act, and it's now an annual event. In addition to the annual celebration, the intent of Trails Day is to develop a public understanding of the importance of trails and the perseverance required to establish, preserve, and maintain them all throughout the year. It's celebrated on the first Saturday in June, and I'm happy to say that American Hiking Society actually named New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Trails Day champion for 3 years in a row. So go New Jersey. So what is the New Jersey Trails Program? Well, it was established in 1974 with the passage of the New Jersey Trails System Act. The following year, the New Jersey Trails Council was established to assist the Trails Program and act as an advisory body to the department. After that, the first New Jersey Trails Plan was released in 1982. The New Jersey Trails Council consists of citizens with interest in different types of trail use, including hiking, bicycling, equestrian, motorized, water, urban, barrier-free, and more. Here's a snapshot of the current membership. And as you can see, it has a good mix of nonprofit, trail interest groups, and also state organizations like DOT, the Division of Parks and Forestry, and the Green Acres program. Just to quickly touch base on the New Jersey Trails Plan, it was first developed in '82, like I mentioned before. It was updated in 1996 and again in 2009. You can view the full plan on the Trails Program website, or just look at the executive summary at the website link there. And hopefully we're looking in the near future to update this. So what is the Recreational Trails Program? Well, after the establishment of the National Recreational Trails Fund Act in 1993, the Recreational Trails Program was established, the grant program was established, and it is the foundation for state trail programs across the country. It's an assistance program of the US DOT's Federal Highway Administration that provides funds to states to develop and maintain recreational trails and trail-related facilities for both non-motorized and motorized recreational uses. The RTP, which is the acronym, is funded through a federal gas tax from off-highway recreational uses. It's a user pay, user benefit type of program, So that means taxes collected for fuel used on the trails directly benefit those trails. There are legislative efforts underway currently to return more of the federal gas tax to the Recreational Trails program, because as you can see, it's funded at less than 1/3 of the revenues generated. So what has been accomplished? Since the inception of the program in 1993, New Jersey has provided over $23 million in financial assistance to more than 970 trail construction and improvement projects. So tying the Trails program back to the topic today, environmental justice, how can we promote environmental justice principles within the New Jersey Trails program? One way to do so is identifying overburdened communities with little to no access to trails, giving extra evaluation points to grant proposals within these communities from a funding aspect, and also promoting resources for inclusionary trail planning, such as the Inclusionary Trail Planning Toolkit that Julia mentioned. This toolkit uses case studies to highlight best practices in inclusionary planning, and it provides a comprehensive toolkit for organizations to promote inclusive trail development. So what is inclusive trail planning? What does that mean? Well, according to this toolkit, the equitable distribution of parks and trails prioritizes neighborhoods that have the highest need for these amenities. But inclusionary planning, on the other hand, prioritizes the participation of residents who have been traditionally underrepresented in the trail planning process. So I'm going to go through some of the components of the toolkit, which I think is a really useful resource for trail planners and communities. The first thing it kind of touches base on is how to start. Community organizing, forging alliances, establishing buy-in and developing leadership. And then it goes into giving you some tools and techniques to understand your community. And it does this by recommending using data, community mapping, and employing social justice frameworks. And to that end, it actually gives you a breakdown of how you can employ social justice frameworks by providing questions you can ask and things to consider when you're doing this, when you're starting out. Another component of the toolkit is the planning events portion, and case studies within the toolkit have shown that the best origin of a project is from the community itself. So it gives you some tools to actually engage the community and make sure that the project starts from the ground up and you're engaging the right people. And then at the end of the toolkit, it basically gives you all the tools, from the beginning planning all the way to implementation of the trail. So it talks about the construction phase, celebrating the opening, programming the trail, and job creation. So going back to how we can promote environmental justice principles within the Trails program, I want to touch base on the component of identifying overburdened communities with little to no access to trails. Well, how are we going to do that if we don't know where all the trails are? Right now, there is no statewide trail geodatabase. There is no statewide trail GIS layer for us to use. So out of the New Jersey Geospatial Forum, a task force formed, the New Jersey Trails Task Force, with the mission to develop a methodology for creating and maintaining statewide data sets of trails. And I'm happy to say that the early milestones of the task force have all been completed. Attribute and schema standards have been developed. All the data has been gathered. And right now we're in the implementation phase. The development of a statewide trail geodatabase is happening right now. So I'm happy to announce that this project will roll out in fall 2021. And at that time, we'll have, for the public's use, a geodatabase of all trails throughout New Jersey. And again, that includes state, county, municipal, nonprofit, and federal trails. So how are we going to use that? Well, as Olivia had mentioned, there is a downloadable GIS layer offered through the Office of Environmental Justice. So using the new statewide trails geodatabase layer and coupling that with a downloadable GIS layer that identifies overburdened communities, we can see where trails don't exist in overburdened communities, and we can focus on those areas. So what are some barriers to access? Well, to begin talking about that, I want to mention the Circuit Trails JEDI Task Force report, and JEDI is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. They had done some market research to identify the motivators and barriers to trail use in diverse and underserved neighborhoods. And the other two goals of this research was to explore the perceptions of trails and the motivations of nearby residents, and to recommend the actions that would better connect trails and engage residents with their trails. So there's a lot of good information in the report, but I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot. All of this will be linked in the resources, so you can reference that after this presentation. But as you can see from here, you're getting a lot, you're starting to understand your community base here. How do underrepresented communities use trails? What are the biggest barriers to trail use in focused communities? As you can see at the bottom, COVID-19 anxiety, public safety concerns, and unwelcoming open spaces, unwelcoming public spaces. The JEDI study then goes into giving you advice on how trail organizations can engage, motivate, and welcome underrepresented trail users. Here are the 5 highlights, but it actually gives you 10 quick steps that are underneath this. So welcoming programming, appropriate security, inviting infrastructure, creative greening, and authentic outreach. So with all that being said, here are some links to the resources I referenced, but you can also go to the resources page of this New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition. And if you want to learn more about the New Jersey Trails program, here's the website here. And if you want to learn more about trails, you can also sign up for the New Jersey Trails program email list. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Renee Reynolds to talk about transportation and equity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Get started. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renee Reynolds, and I am the Executive Director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. Today marks the completion of my first month at Tri-State Transportation Campaign, and it's my pleasure to participate in this conversation while acknowledging crossing a very small but not insignificant milestone. So my remarks today will highlight some of my previous work and personal experiences as a newcomer to New Jersey and to the Trails conversation. And it will hopefully make salient the intersectionality of the work to ensure environmental justice and equity in developing, programming, and sustaining trails as part of a holistic approach to understanding our transportation system as both a critical physical and social infrastructure. So a little bit about Tri-State. Since 1993, TSTC has been an advocacy organization dedicated to mobility, accessibility, and livability in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. TSTC uses data and policy analysis along with strategic media outreach to influence decision makers through the metropolitan region and has been a leading voice in the region for transportation and land use policy reform. Our 4 major priority areas include fixing our commutes, meeting our climate goals, stopping traffic deaths, and making transportation fair. Our work to support development, programming, and ensure the sustainability of trails crosses over all 4 of those priority areas. So before I dive into the importance of trails, I'd like to share some personal previous work experience at the intersection of environmental justice in transportation, as well as a little bit of earlier work on open green space stewardship and how those experiences allow me to see the connections between two issue areas that are often treated as diametrically opposed. So prior to joining TSTC, I led the transportation advocacy effort in New York City's Environmental Justice Alliance, a membership network of grassroots organizations fighting for improved environmental conditions and against inequitable environmental burdens through the coordination of campaigns designed to inform city and state policies. As Olivia framed earlier, the EJ movement was born out of the fight for racial justice in this country, and it remains a call for justice led by frontline communities that have been negatively impacted by racial discrimination that permeated policies and practices that design the systems that govern our lives and our landscapes. In the tri-state area, as it is across the nation, we see the ways that inequitable approaches to transportation funding and design have privileged highways over people, cars over pedestrians, leading to fragmentation and bifurcation of communities rather than supporting meaningful connections. Low-income communities and communities of color bear the brunt of negative health impacts from inequitable transportation policy, suffering from the highest rates of asthma, hospitalization due to respiratory illness, and premature deaths. In the case of New York City, as it is in New Jersey, according to the National Institutes for Health, asthma caused by air pollution in New Jersey has led to higher medical costs, lost job productivity, estimated to cost New Jersey about $450 million annually. And the pandemic only amplified the vulnerability of these communities facing higher mortality rates in Black and Latina communities due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It also laid bare the importance and need for access to open space. But there are many barriers to reconnecting people to the land. As a research project coordinator with the Landscapes of Resilience project, I had the opportunity to work on an initiative in my own neighborhood on the Rockaway Peninsula in New York, which focused efforts to support increased social resiliency in a public housing complex where gardeners, predominantly low-income women of color, lost the use of vital public green space after it was wiped out by Hurricane Sandy. The United States Forest Service, in coordination with the New York City Housing Authority, with funding from the Tom and Kitty Foundation through their Open Space Sacred Place program, hired a landscape architect, a natural builder, a community organizer, and myself to conduct participatory research with the gardeners as they rebuilt their landscapes. So for 2 years, I worked with that community to reinvigorate the grounds, hosting events and supporting other residents to utilize the gardens. But while the initiative was successful in many ways, activating new residents to join in the effort, ultimately management constraints, unsustainable funding, and a lack of maintenance coordination with NYCHA led to many setbacks and left a lot of residents disheartened about their ability to maintain a sense of ownership over the land and partnership with the housing authority. So in addition, there was a proposed trail project that would have connected the waterfront garden to the rest of the adjacent shoreline and surrounding communities. But it was never actualized due to contestation over which government agency would be responsible for developing and maintaining the proposed trail. So, by understanding the intersectionality of these issues, we can begin to make the case more clear to policymakers to recognize the importance of developing trails and ensuring equitable access to them. Trails provide a wealth of benefits to transportation, safety, the environment, our public health, and our economy. 1/4 of all car trips are 1 mile or less. Trails have the ability to link neighborhoods to each other, give children safe routes to school, and enhance the active transportation network of a community. Trails and multi-use paths provide the most separation from vehicular traffic and create safe networks to move around. Trails and green spaces often provide natural buffer zones that protect against streams, rivers, and lakes from, or protect our streams, rivers, and lakes from pollution due to runoff. And they also provide access to outdoor spaces by connecting people to open spaces. It's been found that for every $1 invested in building a trail, there's a direct correlation to $3 saved in medical costs. And with that, I want to give an example, a personal example of an experience on a trail. In 2008, a group of friends and I decided to go on a camping trip. And rather than relying on our cars for the entire journey, we decided to ditch our four-wheel polluting machines in New Haven, Connecticut, and ride our bikes for the remaining 26 miles to Lake Compounce or Bear Creek camping grounds in Bristol, Connecticut. For me, it was the longest, most contiguous ride I'd ever taken with full camping gear on the back of our bike racks. And we began that trail ride on a stretch that ran through Yale University. And it was the first thing that struck out to me, that the trail was integrated with the campus, but it didn't feel like we were trespassing on school property. There had been clear wayfinding signs along the way to lead us there. The Farmington Trail had a variety of features: wide pathways that could accommodate our 11-woman strong convoy, a rich tree canopy that shielded us from the sun, watering holes, marked rest stops, detours so we could grab lunch or visit a cultural space or stop at a creek. The trail was inviting to all kinds of users: families walking slowly, runners, rollerbladers, and folks who just popped in here and there to sit on a bench or to lay on the lawn and read a book. And as you can see, we made it to our destination and we were indeed happy campers. So for me, this trail is exemplary for many reasons, and it's one that I would revisit for sure. So there are many barriers, and Brandi talked a lot about them. They include constraints around the proximity to a trail, the leisure time to visit, transportation access, etc. But what are some of the ways that we can overcome those barriers? I think community members hold the key to both who plays a role in how these solutions are crafted. Research and community input provide the needed insight to guide the remaining mechanisms of change. Legislative changes can be laws that protect vulnerable users. The Safe Passing Bill, which is moving through the New Jersey legislature right now after a decade-long fight from advocates, is an example of the tools we can use to create safer environments for biking and walking. Advancing Vision Zero and complete and green streets policy, when paired with community engagement, are powerful tools for creating communities that are walkable, bikeable, and rollable. So as advocates, it's our job to make sure that the voices of those living in underserved communities are heard. It's to push to make sure that the planning process is inclusive of all residents and that the process meets people where they are, rather than expecting them to make it to a single input session on our schedules. Building trails in a community should come with building trust and understanding what a community actually wants and needs. And sometimes that means putting efforts elsewhere before actually building the trail. So with that, I'll stop there and pass it back for the question portion. If I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, everyone. What great presentations and just so full of information, like really rich content. So thank you. I am going to start with one of my prepared questions, and thanks to a couple of the participants, I'll be peppering in some questions that people have for you as well. So first, I'd like to talk a bit about policy. Now that we're into a second year of living in a pandemic, how do you think policy around open space has responded to the growing attention on outdoor spaces? And do you think that bills such as the Great American Outdoors Act, the Outdoors for All Act, the Transit to Trails Act can actually address the existing inequities of access to park and public lands? And also, please feel free to take this opportunity to tell us about initiatives that your organizations are up to that are working to connect people to nature. I'd like to start with Brandi.
Sure. So I did touch base a little bit on some of the initiatives that the New Jersey Trails program is taking on to address inequities when it comes to access to trails. But in terms of your question, I think it might be beneficial to give a little background about the bills to understand their relationship to trails and equity. So the Great American Outdoors Act provides permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and it also provides money to address maintenance backlog at American national parks. Then the Outdoors for All Act creates dedicated funding through the Land and Water Conservation Act fund to improve state and locally owned parks and other outdoor recreation areas. Then the Transit to Trails Act it directs the DOT to establish a grant program to give grants to certain governmental and private entities for projects that increase transportation access to public lands, waters, parklands, or monuments for critically underserved communities. So basically all of those bills are tools and they provide stepping stones towards equitable access to parks, trails, and greenways, but they're not sufficient to address inequities just on their own. Inequities don't just stem from the proximity or availability of facilities or providing access thereto. There are other barriers to equity that need to be understood and addressed to achieve justice. Some of those barriers to equity were described in the JEDI study that I had mentioned, and also in the inclusionary planning toolkit. Like, for example, an overburdened community might have access to trails and parks, but there might be other barriers like psychological, economic factors that prohibit them from enjoying the facilities. So while the bills ensure the provision of resources, someone has to do the work on the ground. Equity and justice start with inclusive planning, and place-based or community-based efforts offer the best approach to understanding and addressing any potential barriers to access on a local level. So that's what I would say to that.
If I can add to that, not to speak to the federal piece, which I think just Brandi covered really comprehensively. I wanted to just share just in New Jersey at our state parks, forests, and historic sites, which also include 1,000 miles of trails. And also a plug that I love to give for New Jersey is that one of the longest contiguous segments of the East Coast Greenway is within DNR Canal State Park in New Jersey. Yes, definitely worth some applause. So we definitely have trails within our purview. So with that, last year when the pandemic first began, I used to be the director of Parks and Forestry before I came into this job, so I can speak to this firsthand. The visitation that we had last year was absolutely unprecedented. You could pick a random Saturday in the spring before the beginning of peak season, and those parks experienced more visitation than they do on the 4th of July, literally. So we definitely know for residents of New Jersey, they wanted to get outdoors. They wanted to get fresh air. There is no question that our open space and our trail networks are essential. And so when we look at this year where we are, because we've come so much further with vaccinations and everything, one of the initiatives that we have in the state right now is a Vax Pass to our state parks, forests, and historic sites. So I'm going to just drop a link in the chat, and you can peruse that and learn more about a free way to access our parks this season for New Jersey residents.
So Olivia, I just realized that we have a connection there with our access to the East Coast Greenway. It's a farming tin trail that I mentioned as part of that 3,000 miles of trails. So that's really cool to see that whole system, you know, in the ways that we've found access points to it. I would just echo, you know, what Brandi mentioned about, it's not just about building the trail, but the active community engagement work that has to happen on the ground. And I think that should take form in more ways than just, you know, providing programming, but the ways that we are empowering folks to feel like they have some skin in the game in terms of making the trails and management of the trails, et cetera. And I would highlight, you know, the Connecting America's Active Trail System Act, or CATS, I guess you can call it, which would sort of provide a critical need for focusing investment to connecting safe infrastructure for walking and biking. So it's not just about building the trails, but about maintaining the connectivity between these various systems. And the Tri-State Transportation Campaign has been working with community groups to support trail programming. And we have an example of that in Trenton, in the Trenton Ciclovia, which brought together artists and skateboarders and BMX riders and musicians and folks from all different walks of life to sort of activate open space in Trenton.
Thank you. Yeah, these are great initiatives. The Ciclovia is a lot of fun. So great example. So I have a couple questions from some participants who are here. There's a couple for Olivia. One person is wondering how similar or different are the metrics used to develop the Overburdened Communities map to that of the communities of potential disadvantage developed by the DVRPC?
Yeah, so I will note, I am familiar with the DVRPC tool. So I do not work for DVRPC, never have. They have been colleagues. So give me some forbearance here if this is not precise. I'm going to go based on what I remember. My understanding is that the DVRPC metrics have a few more indicators than our state tool does right now. I believe they also pull in some demographics for age, as well as those who may or may not have vehicles or those who may or may not have disabilities. So I think altogether they have around 9 indicators that are a part of their mapping tool. Another thing is I believe that the DVRPC tool looks at data on a census tract level, and our Overburdened Communities map for New Jersey looks at the lens of a block group level, which is a subset below a census tract level. So the data that we have is definitely much more granular. I can say for the direction that we're looking to take with the Overburdened Communities mapping tool is to move forward and populate it with environmental and public health stressors, as well as some materials, some layers that will have environmental and public health benefits. But with the law just being passed in September, we're still in the midst of our rulemaking for that law. And a part of what we'll specify in those layers will also be informed by how we move through this rulemaking process. So certainly stay tuned to see that tool from the state of New Jersey become much more robust with more indicators.
Thank you, Olivia. So another question actually from the audience is also one that I had, so perfect overlap. So often the different sectors of cities work in silos. I think we've all seen this happen, but the reality is that a city is a complicated system, like any ecosystem, where the different sectors really impact one another because we don't work in vacuums. And so this concept, green gentrification, for anyone who's unfamiliar, gentrification partially as a result of the creation or improvement of a local green space seems to be a really good example of a very positive project, but potentially leading to a negative impact of displacing communities that live by a park. A recent study that I guess it was actually a few years ago, City Lab wrote about a study that actually showed that linear parks and greenways tend to have this impact more so on neighborhood than regular neighborhood parks that are like a square, you know, in the middle of a neighborhood. So my question is, what is the role of those who work in either parks or transportation in supporting communities that may face the threat of displacement as a result of a construction of a new park or the renovation of an old park?
Okay, and I'll just quickly touch base on that. It's a good question. It's a really great question, and it's an issue. I mean, I think the best approach is an inclusive and a place-based approach from the beginning planning stages for whatever you want to do could help remedy some of the effects of green gentrification and displacement. First of all, ensuring that nearby residents are the intended beneficiaries of the facilities, and finding out, doing your groundwork, doing your research through the community engagement portion in planning. What are their needs and wants? What will encourage local residents to get outdoors on the trails or in the parks? What's prohibiting them from doing so? And there's also some good resources and planning tools in the inclusionary planning toolkit. Green gentrification is discussed in that document, and it says that it's important for planners and organizers to consider these economic and social factors and the potential for green gentrification before beginning community outreach and engagement. And some cities like Philadelphia take a proactive approach by conducting policy inventory of existing protections to prevent displacement, such as tax assistance programs or long-time owner-occupant programs.
Great.
I wouldn't say anything differently. I feel like you pretty much touched on every point of it. It's much more about acknowledging the risk and validating, you know, people's concerns around gentrification and being proactive and working with the community on those mitigation strategies as you've suggested. So I'll just echo you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's it's a hard question. So thank you for tackling it. So zooming into a more interpersonal scale, if we have successful policies or programs that do increase access to public lands, we still do have to reckon with people who continue to police other people in parks and in public places generally. This has a disproportionate impact on people of color who are often ridiculed and put in harm's way for doing everyday stuff like bird watching. I'm sure a lot of us remember Christian Cooper in Central Park, or barbecuing or gathering in groups. So as we work to expand access, how can those who work in public spaces such as park managers or transportation advocates advocate for more inclusive environments within parks that are truly welcoming spaces for all people?
I can touch on this a little bit. I think one of the things that's most important to advance from an equity perspective is looking at the composition of your staff. And that is your full-time staff, as well as those that you hire on a seasonal or hourly basis when it's peak season. And I certainly know that's the case for us at the New Jersey Division of Parks and Forestry. And we are working to be much more intentional about ensuring that the people who work in our spaces reflect the communities that we serve. Another aspect of it, I think, is just the programming that you offer, that the programming is inclusive, so when people come into a park to participate in the program, either the person who is running the program or the actual topic of the program has some relevant connection to the diverse constituencies we're looking to engage. And then third, I think it's just the culture that we foster in these spaces. One of the things that we did this year in Liberty State Park, in that park, since it opened in 1976, we have a road in the park called Freedom Way, where we raise every flag of every state along that road. And 2 years ago, Governor Murphy decided that he was not going to hang the flag of the state of Mississippi because it had the symbol of the Confederacy embedded within the flag. And he said it would not go back up until the symbol changed. So this year, the symbol changed. It's now a magnolia that was approved by the voters of Mississippi by a significant margin. So when that flag changed and we had the flags being raised, it was usually like about Earth Day weekend. This year, we had a really big ceremony, and we made a point, to say that we would not want to raise that flag in the park because we know that that speaks volumes to people when they come into a space and they see that flying with pride next to other flags that are supposed to be symbols of democracy and freedom and prosperity. So, we just underscore our commitment through efforts like that to show that everybody belongs here and these spaces are important for you. And so I think the more that we can continue to do to further those kinds of statements and further that narrative and embed that type of commitment in our culture, the better our parks and our trails will be.
I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. I feel like, it's a sad reality that unfortunately, and for some, the presence of difference is perceived as a threat and triggers some irrational fear about what the presence of difference means. So in addition to some of the strategies that Olivia just mentioned, I feel like a lot of it has to do with also personal accountability about how we operate in space and the things that we will uphold as the culture of our space. And the ability for people who observe incidences and witness them to uphold and hold other folks accountable when they see clear displays of racial bias against people of color. And I think in addition to what Olivia mentioned about, the makeup of staff who manage green spaces, also around the training for park rangers, for example, to understand and recognize biased behavior so that they're not allowing themselves to be weaponized against folks who are targeted by folks with certain biases or discriminations. In addition to that, I think reviewing and reforming rules that govern public space that might in and of themselves have cultural bias embedded in them and invite people with ill intentions to use those rules as cover for racist behavior. So I think there are a few, many, many strategies that we can, take to determine like what is acceptable and what is unacceptable to us in our public spaces.
Thank you. Thank you both. Really good answers. Lots of big questions. I want to kind of end it in our last couple of minutes actually with a trail specific question from the audience. So one person is wondering, where does the Bergen County Saddle River Bike Walk path fit into the trails equation, and how can it be accessible as a transportation conduit for bikers and walkers to get to important local destinations?
I remember seeing this question come up in the Q&A, and I thought it was a great question. And I want to note, I think that all three of us as panelists wholeheartedly support all the efforts we've been talking about as a part of essential active travel networks, not simply just for conservation and recreation purposes. I think it's a misnomer for us in terms of the work we're trying to advance in New Jersey that is called the Recreational Trails Program. That's not Brandi's fault. She didn't name the program that. But certainly we understand that the vision for these trail networks is much, much broader than recreation and conservation needs, certainly within the context of environmental justice.
And within the context of climate change, and climate resilience. I mean, recognizing that trails provide alternative transportation corridors. It's all part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. I definitely can identify with the person who ask this question of, as somebody who bikes for transportation, I definitely need trails and bike lanes and all of that. So great. Since we only have one more minute, I'm gonna end us there so that we don't go over time. So thank you so much, all of you, for your incredible perspectives and your amazing work that you're doing. I'm like so honored to be to have been here with you today, to have had this conversation with you, and I look forward to where our paths cross again in the future. And thanks to everyone who attended and asked questions. It's really great to have some interaction with the audience. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thank you, Julia.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That was way too short. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.